Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here this very hot Friday afternoon. I'd also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to deliver this paper, which is still work in progress. So before I start, I just wanted to mention that I'm new to the field of NTA. To be very honest, I'm new to the study of the forms of minority accommodation. I do come from political theory. Precisely, I come from liberal egalitarianism, and I've worked for the last, I think, 12 years already on multiculturalism, kin-state responsibility, and kin-state, kin-minority relations. Hence, the interest in the topic is conceptual. I've been curious, I've been looking into what autonomy for minority groups is, how does it sit within multiculturalism, how does it sit, or how is it anchored in liberalism. But I'm also interested in autonomy for minority groups in relation to a kin-state's responsibility. Do kin-states have responsibility to protect the autonomy of kin minorities, and precisely what that responsibility is. I'm also interested in the topic of autonomy because I haven't worked much on freedom per se. I worked a lot on equality, so freedom has been very much ignored in the field in multiculturalism. It's just coming back now. So that being said, I'm going to start my presentation. I hope it'll be a short one though. So today I will be discussing the nature and extent of autonomy for minority groups in the context of the Hungarian minority from Romania. I show that rather than a mechanism through which states fulfill their obligation to protect people's fair opportunity for self-determination, in the base case, autonomy has only become a vehicle through which minority rights are administrated. Why Romania? So that's rather coincidental, the choice of case study. So according to the fifth national report submitted by Romania to the Council of Europe in 2019, I quote, "The situation of the rights of the persons belonging to national minorities has improved substantially from one monitoring cycle to another, and Romania can be considered as an example of good European practices." And end of quotation. So that comes from the Council of Europe's 2019 monitoring report. So that made me turn to Romania, as it is my home country, and I actually wanted to see to what extent Romania is a model. However, a focus on the Hungarian minority highlights the extent to which the group's autonomy is entrenched in a complex nexus of political and economic dependence involving the home state as well as the kin state. And I argue here that the exercise of autonomy in cases such as the one discussed in my presentation is in fact at odds with the legal and political development of the idea of autonomy for minority groups in Europe, and has not only weakened its normative foundations, but more worryingly, it made it evanescent. So that is my paper in brief. The plan of, I think there was another slide before, right? Thank you. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit more extensively about the conceptualization of autonomy for minority groups. Then I'll focus very briefly on the way cultural autonomy has been articulated in Romania. And lastly, I will just present some factual information, mostly on the Hungarian minority and the nexus of dependence that I've already mentioned. So I'm going to start with the political theory part. So despite recent growing interest on the autonomy for minority groups, the conceptualization of autonomy remains normatively weak. A right to autonomy continues to be absent in international law, while autonomy for minority groups persists as being contentious and continues to be rejected on the grounds that it threatens the state territorial integrity and sovereignty. The reluctance is even more acutely present in Central and Eastern Europe, where a right to self-determination was rooted in forms of cultural autonomy enjoyed under Ottoman, Habsburg, or Tsarist empires. Recently, autonomy has been defended as a constructive approach to address the imbalance between majorities and minority groups. And I'm referring here to a seminal article published in 1999 by Jane Wright, in which she argues that autonomy represents a mechanism through which a right to self-determination can be extended to all people living within the territory of a state. Now, the understanding of autonomy for minority groups seems to be dominated by practice rather than norms. And we've had plenty of examples today of how different the practices of NTA are. And it is profoundly marked by the absence of a right to autonomy for minority groups in international law, and more generally of a broader normative discussion underpinning its conceptualization. Autonomy is used to label a capacity of a group, and then it is discussed in the context of territorial autonomy or power-sharing arrangements, as well as more specifically as forms of self-rule in different areas of public policy, often education, culture, but also taxing, housing, and/or healthcare. Many scholars point out that conceptualizing autonomy is further complicated by the different forms the arrangements take. The distinction between territorial autonomy and non-territorial autonomy remaining the dominant one in the scholarship. In his welcoming attempt to conceptualize non-territorial autonomy, Levente-Charlotte poignantly notes that the nature and extent of autonomy are further determined by the context and justification of implementing such arrangements, legitimacy and support, institutional particularities, levels of entrenchment, and outcomes. So what are the normative pillars of autonomy for minority groups? So Notens highlights a current consensus in the scholarship that autonomy is consistent with and conducive of integration, and stresses the importance of recognition of ethnocultural differences, so recognition on one hand, as well as the need to ensure the political, economic, and cultural participation of the members of minority groups in the public sphere in order to enhance such conceptions of autonomy. She further adds that the recognition of national minorities as cultural linguistics group may, however, become a powerful tool used by national states to limit the range of claims such groups can make against different forms in which the hegemony of a majority group may be exercised. So she says that the dominance can manifest itself in the economic and political sphere, not only in the area of culture. However, rather than strengthening the group's freedom from domination, which should be something that would follow from Notens' arguments, or the consensus that she mentioned, the demands of or the institutionalization of autonomy for minority groups under many arrangements, in fact, suggest conceptualization of freedom, which is at odds with the liberal and republican traditions. And I'll explain very briefly why. In Europe, the accommodation of national minorities has maintained and strengthened the interference of the home state. A positive example, or a positive approach, a positive example of accommodation was seen to be one according to which minority ethnocultural identities and cultures are positively recognized and promoted by the home state. Now, according to Article 5 of the Framework Convention for the protection of national minorities, and I quote, "The parties, meaning the member states, undertake to promote the conditions necessary for persons belonging to national minorities to maintain and develop their culture and to preserve the essential elements of their identity, namely their religion, language, traditions, and cultural heritage." End of quotation. However, as already anticipated by Philippe Petit, in an article published in 1996, such conception of freedom, as the one illustrated by Article 5 of the Framework Convention, which endorse state interference, may create relationships of dependency, social hierarchies, and/or enhance the use of arbitrary power. And hence, the case of the Hungarian minority in Romania is very, very illustrative in this respect. The autonomy of the Hungarian minority in Romania has become embedded in the power structure, and its exercise increasingly dependent upon kin state funding. I further argue that the complex nexus of dual economic and political dependence on the home state and kin state makes it increasingly difficult to argue, in fact, that the autonomy of the group is consistent with an obligation to protect their fair opportunity to self-determination. So in other words, I question the mere idea of autonomy in the case of the Hungarian minority in Romania. I'm going to just sketch a little bit the history of the conceptual history of cultural autonomy in Romania. So first of all, ethnic Hungarians, as you've already learned from the previous presentation, continue to be the largest national minority in Romania, totaling 1,227,000 persons. That was in the census from 2011, and hopefully in a few months we'll find out the number when the new results of the new census will be published. In the first 2 decades after the Second World War, Romania generally treated its Hungarian minority generously. I don't want to go so far back, but it's worth pointing, for those of you who are interested in the history of the Hungarian minority here, the policies of the Groza government would be considered very generous for the period after the Second World War. Now obviously the situation deteriorated after 1956, and increasingly shifted from an accommodationist approach to an assimilationist approach in the late 1970s and 1980s. The status and rights of national minorities, but in particular of the Hungarian one, have remained on the whole contentious issues in Romania after 1989. In fact, nationalism, understood as the majority's attempt to maintain and strengthen its political, cultural, and economic dominance, remained the driving ideology in the first year after the fall of communism. Even though one of the first measures taken by the Romanian authorities after the fall of communism was to ensure a constitutional right to parliamentary representation for all national minorities. So I'm referring here to the law on public administration, also adopted in 1991, made Romanian the only language to be used in official settings. So on one side, minorities were given a voice, a political voice, but on the other hand, the cultural, political, and economic dominance of the Romanian majority was being strengthened. Moreover, the law of education, which was implemented in 1995, imposed further restrictions upon the education in minority languages to the ones that had already been in place, quite cruel ones, since 1986. So the situation for the Hungarian minority started improving, to be correct, after the elections of 1986, when Udrea, the Hungarian party, joined the governing coalition. Since 1996, provisions targeting cultural minorities and referring to the use of and education in the mother tongues and their representation in the parliament and local administration, though scattered in the Romanian law, have strengthened the recognition of national minorities in Romania. So without any doubt, the most significant achievement in that period was the amended law on local public administration of 2001, which grants cultural minorities the right to use their languages in public matters if the number of individuals belonging to a minority passes the threshold of 20% of the population of the settlement. Now, the notion of cultural autonomy, or the closest articulation of non-territorial autonomy that we have in Romania, was introduced for the first time in the Romanian legal system through a draft law on the status of national minorities. And that draft law was first discussed in 2005. Article 57 defines cultural autonomy as, and I quote, the capacity of a national minority to exercise decision-making powers regarding issues pertaining to its cultural, linguistic, and religious identity through councils selected by its own members. Article 58 further specifies the areas to which cultural autonomy applies, namely education in minority languages, media, cultural heritage, and the management of the financial support received from the state. So these are the areas. Now, despite a lengthy critique of the draft law, the Council of Europe notes in its opinion from 2005 that the introduction of cultural autonomy is in fact, or would have been, let's put it this way, a positive step in the direction of strengthening the participation of national minorities. The opinion, however, further states that, and I quote, the form of cultural autonomy contained in the draft law would ensure real decision-making powers to the representatives of national minorities, mainly through their binding consent and not just consultation rights, as in the case in some other countries. Now, whilst the Council of Europe praises the novelty and revolutionary character of the legislation, it also points out to a number of uncertainties contained in the draft, among which the most prominent is the envisaged institutionalization of cultural autonomy, which may weaken the actual exercise of cultural autonomy, according to them. The opinion highlights that the draft law does not clearly delineate the new competencies of cultural autonomy from those of other institutions already in place, such as various state autonomies, the Parliamentary Committee of Human Rights, Denomination and National Minorities, the Council of National Minorities, and the organizations of citizens belonging to national minorities. Now, the draft law was rejected by the Senate in 2005. It was brought back to the Parliament for further discussion in 2012, which concluded with it being resent to the Parliamentary Committee of Human Rights and Denomination and National Minorities for further amendments. Most recently, the Udrea attempted to bring it back on the agenda of the Parliament in 2019, but this attempt failed. Decker argues that the main drawback of the draft law remains its incompatibility with the Romanian legal context, a drawback that has still not been addressed since its inception in 2005. It is important, however, to note that a big number of scholars remark that the Central and East European states, including Romania, often chose to pursue such policies not as a matter of justice, but viewed them instrumentally beneficial to qualify for EU membership primarily. So said differently, external pressure and domestic political bargaining overwhelmingly defined the nature and extent of Romania's minority accommodation policies, while broader consideration of justice have been at best secondary, hence the chaotic policies that we have in Romania. I'll turn now to the nexus of dependence. I'll start by briefly telling you a little bit about state support for minority groups in Romania. So the Romanian state only supports financially the national minority groups which are represented in the Romanian parliament. Now, the right to parliamentary representation of all national minority groups has been constitutionally safeguarded since 1991. However, the financial support is allocated and managed through the Council of National Minorities, broadly defined as one of the consultation bodies of the Romanian government. Initially set up in 1993 to bring together all organizations representing national minorities, in 2001 representation in the Council was reserved exclusively to those minorities that obtain a seat in the Parliament. Now, the total budgetary allocation for national minorities has increased gradually. So in 2001 it was 90 million, 90 million, which translates in about 2,340,000 pounds. So it increased, it doubled from 2001 to 2021. Now, each organization receives an amount which is determined largely by the size of the minority group it represents, but also the cultural and educational activities it plans to undertake that year, its specific socioeconomic characteristics, as well as the level of influence they have in the council. The Hungarian minority represented now by Udrea is the largest minority group in Romania, totaling 63% of the persons belonging to national minorities, and we also receives the largest percentage of the allocation, approximately 19%, followed by the Romani people and the German minority. Interestingly, I'm going back to the Advisory Council of the of FCNM. Their report, the most recent report, noted that the money allocated to national minorities has been mainly spent on the purchase, construction, or refurbishment of workplaces, equipment, and salaries, rather than the protection and promotion of the group's identity and culture. So that comes out from their last report. Now, the role of the kin state. Now, now there is a lot to talk about the relations between the Hungarian state and the Hungarian minority in Romania. I just wanted to point out a few things that I consider to be very important. So first of all, the policies of the Hungarian government in the last decade have strengthened the ties between ethnic Hungarians and the current ruling party, Fidesz. But I also increased the economic dependence of the Transylvanian Hungarian upon their kin state. In a very recent article, Eva Balog, so that's from 2021, notes, and I quote, "The Transylvanians received not only money from the Hungarian state, but also citizenship and voting rights. The Transylvanian will not be impressed by him," and she was referring to the counter candidate to Orban, Peter Marki Zoi, or anyone else from outside Fidesz. And I went, and the quotation. This was an interview with her that was published just before the Hungarian election. How did we get here? So by mid-1990s, bilateral agreements were signed between Hungary and Romania and Slovakia, respectively, which ultimately aimed to strengthen the protection of Hungarian minorities in the neighboring states, but primarily in Slovakia and Romania, as well as the home state's commitments to achieve a fair accommodation of their minority groups. However, the almost unanimous vote in favor of the adoption of Act 62 on Hungarians living in the neighboring countries in 2001, also known as the Hungarian Status Law, reflected a general disappointment in the Hungarian parliament with the fact that bilateral agreements had proved unable to better the conditions of Hungarian minorities in the neighboring states, to the point in which both Slovakia and Romania would have recognized them as partner nations. Now, this Act 62 on the Hungarians living in the neighboring countries defines as a key state duties, identity recognition and support for Hungarian culture abroad, and also following the amendments brought to the Act in 2003. It sort of centers on improving the fate of Hungarians living in the neighboring countries. Now, the obligation to support Hungarian culture abroad have a dual nature. Within its territory, the Hungarian state facilitates the equal access of its ethnic kin to education and culture, while beyond its borders, it promotes the Hungarian culture and education in their home states. So this you can find in Article 13, 14, and 18 of the amended version of the Act. So this, after these two acts, the original act and the amended one from 2003, in 2011, the Hungarian Parliament passes the Act on Hungarian nationality, which facilitates the access of Hungarians in the neighboring states, but not only to Hungarian citizenship. And I'll just come a little bit closer. Now, in recent years, even though there has been an overwhelming focus on extraterritorial citizenship, Hungary has also initiated a few initiatives targeting specifically the ethnic Hungarians from the neighboring states. So in 2016, the Hungarian government allocated 4.8 million to Hungarian language nurseries in Transylvania precisely. Since early 2018, the Hungarian minority in Romania is the direct beneficiary of two new government funding initiatives, namely the Hungarian Government Ordinance 2061 from 2017 on the assistance offered to the organizations abroad, and the Hungarian Government Ordinance 2074 from the same year on providing the necessary resources for the programs in Transylvania and on ensuring their financial assistance. It has been very difficult to find out the amount of money that comes from Hungary enters Romania. It's certainly much higher than the one offered by the Romanian government. I'm still digging into this. Now, most recently in 2021, the Hungarian government created a new platform for investing in agriculture in the neighboring states. Now, while following the criticism of the Slovak government, this program was no longer targeting Slovakia. Still, it appears that despite the initial opposition of the Romanian government against such economic programs, it continues in Romania. There is quite a lot of money invested in agricultural development, which has been invested in agricultural development in the last 6 months. Now, to conclude, it is, as I said, my interest in the topic is conceptual mostly. I find it very difficult to, after looking at facts, to argue that we can actually talk about autonomy of Hungarian minority in Romania. this dependence, this nexus of dependence that defines its status, it defines its fate. To be very honest, makes it from a theoretical point of view hardly to argue that we do have a case of autonomy. However, what is interesting though is that looking into the literature, especially into the political theory literature on freedom, I thought, so again, that's something that needs a little bit more reflection. I thought that it's perhaps the time to go back to the sketching board and look again into what are the normative goals of autonomy, whether territorial or non-territorial. To start basically from the beginning. What are we aiming? What is it aimed with such forms of accommodation, and work from there to make the arrangements a little bit better at safeguarding those values that we aim to protect. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andreea. We have around 20 minutes left. Oh, okay, just under 15. So we can take questions specifically to Andreea, and then if you have any other general reflections that bring together the three papers, please do that. Leventa, you wanted to ask?
Yes, I wish to thank you, Andreea, for this very insightful, also emphatic view on this axis of dependence. That is particularly the aspect of the issue which I am interested in. Regarding to what extent can we talk about also cultural autonomy regarding the Hungarian minority in Romania. I think your approach is very professional. Yes, you said that it is up to the draft law, which was submitted in 2005, and then that is where it stopped. I will try to challenge this proposal with alternative interpretation tomorrow. Again, formally, it is precise and accurate what you say. I think there is space for interpretation beyond. I think that there is a large area of de facto cultural autonomy which could be taken into account, and why it is in limbo between de facto and the jure. I try to highlight tomorrow. Now, I would like to come back to the dependence issue, and there are a couple of very interesting things which could be highlighted here in addition, which also explains us about the dynamics of minority policy and assistance offered to minorities. So, firstly, you mentioned at some point that you couldn't find exact data regarding the amount of money provided by the Hungarian state. That was really a problem for not so very long ago, but I think it is about half a year or something like that ago when the data were disclosed under the pressure of minority organizations and minority Hungarian language press in Pennsylvania. So now we know the data, it's very accurate data are available. And it is extremely interesting to see that the peak of the amount was in 2014. That was the absolute peak, and a huge amount of money was channeled into these Hungarian organizations in Pennsylvania. And then there was a decrease, and then still significant. So I think coming back to the first presentation, where we were provided by data regarding what is the amount of money provided by the Romanian state to different minorities. I think there the case of the Hungarian minority could be added, could be completed with this very, very significant other type of support, and again, reliable information are available. Now, what I would like to say here, why in 2014? Why happened this peaking, and what happened behind this support? So the story, as you outlined, so I think the most important points have been said, Yet it is interesting to see that this minority, so this support offered by the Hungarian state to the minorities abroad, and particularly to Transylvania, which is the biggest community in the neighborhood. Now, I have to be brief, and my statement is going to be sharp, but I think it can be interpreted. So it is often stated in the Hungarian minority analysts that this support is not really about the Hungarian minorities abroad. It is, in fact, about the fight for taking control over the Hungarian state. So that assistance provided to minorities abroad was a very effective instrument used by the political forces in in Hungary, in order to capture the state. Now, what is going on in Hungary, probably we all know. There's different works, different interpretations can be used. One discourse talks about illiberalism, but in fact, what we can see is an attempt to capture the state. And the successful project, which has managed to capture the state in 2010, and it keeps captured since, has used this support offered to minorities abroad as an instrument of competing the other political forces, and it has been used very effectively. Now, there is something interesting what happened in 2014. Of course, this attempt to capture the Hungarian state using the assistance offered to minorities abroad as an instrument generated a whole discursive space. And in this discursive space, it was a very interesting argument that the Romanian state failed to offer the Hungarian minorities a level of protection it needed or it required. So, in a way, the Hungarian policy has drawn the conclusion that the minority in Romania is in danger, that the conditions which would safeguard preventing assimilation or other things of disappearance are not provided, so the Hungarian state has to come in and provide alternatives. That was one thing, and the second thing was in financial terms that until 2012, that was the last moment when Udrea participated in a government coalition, and the way how leftist government coalition was rather dramatic, and it didn't seem very likely that in a foreseeable future it could be again invited in a. So it was said that its coalition building potential has been absorbed. There is no more left of it. And at that moment, when this was the assessment, the Hungarian minority was cut off of an important part of the assistance provided by, it was cut off from access to state resources which they had access through participating in the government. So I think that in addition to the data we were provided as outcome of the minority protection policies, it is important to mention that there are many more resources used by the Hungarian minority which are due to this occasional participation. And then in 2014, these two types of arguments came together and reinforced one another. One, that the Romanian minority regime cannot guarantee the level of protection the Hungarian minority needs. One. Secondly, that the Hungarian minority does not access state resources at a satisfactory level, and that is how the Hungarian state has practically started this very, very significant. Okay. Of course, again, these are the arguments which have been used, but we always have to see behind these arguments this interest of. And 2014 was an interesting turning point, or a moment where this overwhelming influence the actual leading party in Pennsylvania has today did not exist yet in 2014. So that was the moment when reinforcing the positions was important for them. So that is what I could contribute, but I'm really very appreciative for the work you do and all the results you have done so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evan. This is incredible.
Would you like to respond at all?
By taking notes.
Any further questions? We have a few minutes left. 8 minutes, in fact.
It's very interesting how the key state invests in the minority here in Romania. If we are talking about the barriers to minority in Romania, and I cannot understand why they want to invest not in culture but in sports or in agriculture. I mean, things that they are not related to non-cultural autonomy. It's a mystery to me, this field of investment for them.
That it's argued by experts to what extent sports or agriculture are not related to cultural autonomy, as I correct. Since the Hungarian status of the Act 62 from 2001, in the text of the actual act, it's mentioned that the well-being of Hungarians living in a neighboring state is not just about identity, culture, but it also has an economic dimension. Now that's, we are in legal terms, we already have it there since 2001. I would argue, I think to do some research on that, the framework or the opportunities opened by the European Union were used to invest to invest in the Hungarian minorities in the neighboring states to support them differently. As for yes, I mean we do know that Orban invested a lot of money in various stadiums, right? Hockey. Is it a hockey arena in Turkomores? There's no and I forgot. I think at some point I knew also the football stadiums that were built. I think it's easier to argue that they support the cultural autonomy of that.
Thank you. Any further questions on the floor? Last chance. If not, then I suggest we can finish a little bit earlier. Flavia, I know you had a couple of announcements you wanted to make about later, about dinner. Very important subject.
We invite again for those who were last night and for those who coming today. We invite all of you at Barca restaurant, Barca, at 7, starting at 7.
And it's just next to the, what's the name of the hotel?
Ramada
Hotel.
Yes, it's
By the way, very nice spot. You didn't go last night, which I did. So yeah, is there anything else? Any other administrative? Yeah. So can I just thank all our speakers again for a very interesting session. There's a lot, and I think eventually the papers fitted together very well, and there's a lot of food for thought we can take from this. So thank you all, and thanks for the questions and the discussion.